Hello and welcome everyone. So today's session is on asset allocation and behavioral finance. It's been conducted by Mr. Madhav Bhushan, Vice President and Trustee IYEA. If you have any doubts, you can put them up in the chat box. Over to you, sir.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining in today's session. And so, this is a series of sessions that we are holding with the IYEA, which is the Indian Youth Economic Association, for our mentorship and internship program. Yesterday, we had our session on introduction to financial markets. And building onto that, today, our second session in finance will be on asset allocation and behavioral finance. This is a very basic introduction to these topics. Obviously, these topics can be studied in a lot of depth. And so I wanted to cover some of the basics. And most of the content that I've taken in terms of definitions are mainly from the CFA curriculum provided by the CFA Institute, so that it's more relatable and you can always go back and read about these topics in further detail. So, as I assume that all of you have got a basic idea of introduction to financial instruments yesterday in our session. Building on, what happens is that various financial instruments need to also be allocated in the right manner, and this allocation has to be tailor-made for specific individuals. So if we go into the basic definition, asset allocation refers to an investment strategy in which individuals divide the investment portfolios between different asset classes to minimize investment risks. So if we take the broad buckets of asset classes, they are classified into equity, fixed income, your cash and cash equivalents, and your alternative assets. Within alternative assets is basically things like real estate, art, gold. You can also go on to include stuff like your sports teams. Some people invest in sport teams, and some people might invest in other avenues which they feel might generate a return. So it's a very broad spectrum. But I specifically tried to focus more on gold because that is an asset that has been drawing a lot of attention lately, and it's also from an Indian perspective an asset that people always consider in their asset allocation. So now, the thing is that most of these assets have different levels of return and risk, and they will behave differently over time. So, an optimal mix of these assets is what you need to balance your risk and return. Now, you do have extremes of the spectrum where some people are purely wanting to get the highest return possible without any regard for risk. This is a very small percentage of people, and they might argue that 100% of your investment should be in equity. There's also a class which does not want to take any risk on their investments whatsoever, and they might stick to debt completely. And within debt, also they might just stick to treasury bonds, where the credit risk is probably the lowest. But that is not a correct investment decision because that is not going to give you the best risk return adjusted portfolio that you should actually be aiming for. So to build on why we need why asset allocation is important, I have an Indian example with me. So this is basic data for the last 40 years that we have, where we are looking at the inflation rate. Then we are looking at the returns that gold has given. We are looking at silver, FDs, that are fixed deposits. We are looking at the public provident fund, and then we are looking at the Sensex, which is a proxy for your equity returns. Now, for the last 40 years, if I take the inflation, you can view it here, that inflation has roughly been 6.52% on a compounded annual growth rate basis. And if we subtract the inflation rate from returns of the respective assets, you will see that silver has actually just barely managed to beat inflation. Gold, however, has been a good proxy and beaten inflation by almost 2%. Also, these figures are as on 31st March 2020. So the more recent spike in gold is not getting reflected in these returns. Similarly, FDs have also roughly given about 2.1%. Your public provident fund has actually proven to be a very good option, where it has beaten inflation by 2.89%. And equity, as always, and you would have seen various resources where these kind of figures come up. Equity has beaten inflation by 7.19% in India in the last 40 years on a compounded basis. So, which makes the argument that you should invest in equity. But if you focus on the last year's return itself, equity has given you minus 24%. In fact, if you're just invested in January thinking that, okay, equity is the best asset class, it gives the highest return, you would be in a slightly uncomfortable position right now where your portfolio would have fallen by 20%. So, this is why asset allocation is important, because different assets also have different cycles and they necessarily don't coincide with each other. So you need a portfolio that sort of balances out the bad cycles in a certain assets with the good cycles in the other assets. So what are the factors that also please feel free to post your questions on the in the chat box, and after I'll be taking questions in the middle of the session as well, so I'll let you know. So, what are some of the factors that you need to consider when you're deciding on an asset allocation for, say, a client? And the first basic thing is that there is no single formula that you can apply to arrive at an asset allocation for every individual. It's an exercise that needs to be tailor made. You can have some ground rules that you follow, but ultimately it's a very personal exercise. It's a very individual exercise. There is no fixed rule. All these calculators available online, they cut corners. They are basic models which only give you a brief idea as to what you need to do. But to arrive at a good asset allocation, or should I say the right asset allocation, you need to put in more effort. Now, the second point is what is very important is yesterday you covered different financial instruments. When we're talking about asset allocation, we are not talking about specific financial instruments. We are talking about first the broad allocation. So when I say equity, I'm not going into details of large cap companies, small cap companies, or even private equity. I am looking at just equity exposure. So first step of the asset allocation is to do your broad allocation, and within that, then you move into, okay. So if my say my exposure will be 50% in an equity in equities, out of that 50%, I want at least 80% to go in large cap stocks because I have a low risk tolerance. So that is step number two. But the first step is to do a broad allocation. Now, how do you do this broad allocation? Well, first you look at the risk appetite. Now, risk appetite, like I said, will vary from person to person. And there are two major determinants within risk appetite. First is your risk capacity. So, how much risk can you afford to take? This will depend on your financial situation, on how much liability you have, whether you have student loans or you have loans on your house, or say you have a large family that you are supporting alone. These are all factors that will determine your risk capacity. Second is risk tolerance. So some people might be capable of taking a lot of risk. They might be very well off and they might be in a very comfortable financial situation, but they might have zero tolerance for risk because their focus has now shifted to preservation of wealth rather than building of wealth. And at the same time, you have somebody who might be living from paycheck to paycheck, but still will have a very high risk tolerance and will be betting on very small speculative stocks and will be perfectly comfortable with it. So when we are judging risk appetite, we have to look at both risk capacity and risk tolerance. And the focus is that your tolerance is secondary. First is capacity. So while you might be willing to take risks, you have to, as an investment advisor, first decide whether the client can afford to take that amount of risk. So this is, I think, a very major thing that a lot of people skip when assessing risk, because sometimes it's easier to pitch products which are readily available than to pitch products to clients which are suited to them, and that's key. Second is looking at investor goals. This is something that is now becoming common practice amongst financial advisors, and it's a very good thing. Investor goals are important because they give you a direction. All of us as human beings are always looking for direction in our lives. We are told that go to school, first do your undergrad, then do your masters, then look for a good paying job. It's all directional. Similarly, investor goals are a good starting point. to always when you're determining the asset allocation. And they also help you give insight into the time horizon that is available with the investor. So some goals might be very immediate. Like somebody might say, okay, I am going to business school next year, so I have some amount saved and I want to save some amount further. And next year, this is an expense that I'm definitely going to undertake. Some people might have longer goals that they're like, okay, I want to buy my own house in 10 years. I want to buy a car in the next 3 years. Or some people might be very simple. I just that they might say that okay, we are looking at wealth creation and we want to have a good retirement purpose. So that means they have a longer term. So a common practice now is also become planning in a goal specific manner. And I will cover this in strategies of asset allocation later on, where people individually plan for goals and then overall take a picture. So planning for individual goals of a client actually results in a good asset allocation for an individual also. So that's an approach that is becoming very popular, and I will cover it in more detail later on. The third is the portfolio volatility. Now, the very purpose of doing asset allocation is to reduce the volatility in your portfolio. Like I said, if you go for a completely equity driven portfolio, equity will always work in cycles. You have a bull market, you have a bear market. And this will lead to times of extreme joy and also extreme pressures or fear. So, which is not exactly advice for any client. So any asset that you add to your portfolio has to essentially also reduce your portfolio volatility. We recommend not introducing assets that will increase your portfolio volatility unless and until they are increasing your expected return by a significant proportion as well. So, like if somebody has a 100% debt portfolio, obviously the portfolio volatility will increase if you introduce equity into the portfolio. But then your expected returns are also at par with the increase in the volatility that you are. So then that decision makes sense. And finally, in when we talk about asset allocation, most important is the existing portfolio of a client. Whenever a client comes to you and say they've not done any asset allocation yet, they will still most likely have an existing portfolio. They will have some money parked in, say, FDs, or they might have some stocks that they're already holding, or they might have inherited. And they might also just have all their money in a savings account that is also money allocated in debt, or rather you can say cash and cash equivalents. So you have to look at a person's existing portfolio, because say there are illiquid assets as well, like if somebody's inherited certain real estate or certain art, so that is also a part of their portfolio and you have to take it into account, but they're not very liquid. So when you're rebalancing, you have to focus more on the portfolio that can be reallocated. And it is also important to periodically revisit the portfolio and rebalance it, and to make sure that the portfolio is on track. And that is again something that we'll discuss in more detail when we get into strategies of asset allocation. So this is like a very basic depiction of how asset allocation works. So we've taken an example of Aman, who's 50 years old, and he wanted to save for his retirement. And he's saying that he wants to retire in the by the age of 55, so that's in 5 years, and he has about 10 lakhs in savings already. So a very basic and a common tool that you might have also read about or heard of is the age-based asset allocation model, where they say that 100 minus your age is what you should be investing in equity. Some people have recently started arguing that 110 or 120 minus your age should actually be your allocation in equity. So these things keep changing, but this is just an example. So suppose we arrived at 50% allocation to equity, then we did a 35% in fixed income, 10% in cash, and 5% in alternative assets. Now, after this broad allocation, we went a step further and we like, okay, out of this 50%, how much will we go in small companies which have potential for growth, and large companies where value has not yet been unlocked, and also looking at international stocks, because a common problem with investing in general is sometimes that we focus only on things that we are comfortable with or we are aware of, and that restricts you in terms of geography. It's a very major factor for most people. So you also take exposure to international stocks, thereby reducing your portfolio volatility, because now you have exposure not just to a single country but multiple countries. Then within fixed income, you decide to go for some government bonds, which are presumably more safe, and some high yield bonds where while the credit risk increases, your returns also increase. Then you decide to keep 10% cash in a savings account, bare minimum return, hardly beating inflation, but it's liquid money that you can use immediately. And then you take in a gold exposure in sovereign gold. So if you see the pie chart for the portfolio, it's shades of blue represent equity, shades of orange represent fixed income, then you have your cash in green, and alternative assets in gray. The next step after this would typically be to identify which small cap stocks to invest in. So now that we have 10 lakh corpus, and out of that 25% is going in small cap stocks, that means your allocation is of 2.5 lakhs in small cap growth stocks. Now you will have to decide that, will you invest in just one small cap growth stock? Will you invest in two, three, five? It is up to you. And then you build a strategy on how you deploy. Because after allocation, the next step is actually to deploy money and make sure you achieve that asset allocation. And then you go on and balance your portfolio. So the broad step is to come at this asset allocation. So how can we do this? Well, basic strategies I've covered. Obviously, this is not an exhaustive list, and but these are some of the common strategies that you'll come across even when you read a lot of material on asset allocation. So you have your insured asset allocation, which is basically you define a minimum level of a portfolio at different time intervals. And as long as your portfolio value is, say, above that base level, you do not fiddle around with the asset allocation. But in case your portfolio falls below that level, you reassess and make changes to your portfolio in order to achieve that base value. Your life cycle funds asset allocation is a very simple, no effort allocation where you simply look at funds which target a specific goal and focus on asset allocation. So you, even in India, in mutual funds, you have certain retirement funds and children funds. They have restrictions of when you can withdraw and what purposes you can withdraw the money for, and they have a longer lock-in period. So these are funds that automatically do the asset allocation, and it's a general rule applied to everyone. So it is not exactly recommended because, again, like I said, every individual's asset allocation needs to be specific to their goals and their risk appetite. And this sort of is like a one-stop solution for everybody. So it obviously is not going to be 100% accurate for a given investor. Then you have a constant weight asset allocation. This is a common strategy that's been used, but now slowly is losing its popularity. That's it. That said, that when suppose in our previous model, Aman's allocation to equity was 50%. Now let's say that after we deploy the money in the given allocation, the equities CST price in say 3 months, and it rises by 10%, whereas other assets say have largely been at the same level. So your equity will reflect a higher percentage than 50% in your portfolio. So under constant weight asset allocation, what you will do is you will sell some of the equity to arrive back at the asset allocation that you had initially targeted. So that is constant weighting. So it's a very active asset allocation strategy that people employ. Very popular, but now losing a little bit of its popularity because people feel that it actually leads to sometimes getting rid of good stocks in your portfolio and getting stuck with bad stocks that don't do that well. Tactical asset allocation is actually an example of what I talked about earlier when I talked about goal specific asset allocation. So that's having specific goals and doing an asset allocation for those goals, and then looking at a broad picture. So it's most short term and it is more specific to a given goal. So that's why it's called tactical asset allocation. We saw an example of an age-based asset allocation. Obviously, your base of age is something that is always debated. Like 100 was the common base that is used to be taken, but recently people have started saying that your base actually should be 110 or 120. So this keeps changing. And the last and the most common, most popular strategy for asset allocation is your dynamic asset allocation. This is nothing but a combination of various asset allocation strategies. Here, the good part is that people recommend having a range. when you allocate assets. So you don't say that, okay, I will have only 60% of my assets in equity. You might say that my equity exposure in the total portfolio will vary from 40 to 60%. And then you define levels as to, okay, some people might take a price to earning level of the index, and they might say that, okay, at 25 PE, my exposure will be 40%. At 20 PE, I will increase my allocation to equity and have 50% of my assets in equity. And let's say PE of 15, I will increase it further to 60. So that is what dynamic asset allocation sort of entails. So that's something that's more personal, more tailor made, and it is also, yes, very active strategy for asset allocation, and it's the most popular nowadays. So what are our key takeaways today when we talk about asset allocation? Well, asset allocation tries to balance risk by dividing assets among investment vehicles. The risk return trade-off is at the core of what asset allocation is all about. You have to understand your investors goals in order to go about allocating their assets. Time allows you to take advantage of compounding, and time there's a value of there's a time value of money that's also there, which we covered in inflation, but I that's there. And then monitoring portfolio volatility and regular rebalancing of portfolio is actually key to effective asset allocation. At this point, I'll be open to taking any questions that any of our interns, mentees, attendees would like to ask about asset allocation. Like I said, this is just a very broad covering of the topic. We will slowly dive deeper into specifics of different strategies. Any questions? All right, moving on. So, asset allocation is one thing, and once you've decided what your asset allocation is, you come to the stage of deployment, or actually going about, allocating your assets in the given allocation. And this is where things sort of deviate, because this allocation is being done by an investor or a financial advisor, and they are nothing but humans. They are not robots, and they get influenced by their emotions. They have a thinking brain, and they might take decisions which fall outside the ambit of the asset allocation. And this is why behavioral finance has become really popular as a branch of study, because we always study traditional finance models in school, in college, and we see that in the real world, these rules always don't stand. And the reason they don't really stand is that ultimately investors are not always rational. And that is why this stream of behavioral finance is gaining a lot of importance. You'll see a lot of coaches talking about purely psychology and recommending, following certain rules that will help you get rid of certain biases that you have in your mind. So we'll cover these topics. So basic definition of behavioral finance. Well, it is the study of the influence of psychology on the behavior of investors or financial analysts. It also includes the subsequent effects on the markets. It focuses on the facts that investors are not always rational, have limits to their self-control, and are influenced by their own biases. Behavioral finance attempts to understand and explain observed investor and market behavior. This differs from traditional finance, which is based on hypotheses about how investors and markets should behave. At its core, behavioral finance is about understanding how people make decisions, both individually and collectively. Now, this is very important, that this is about how people make decisions both individually and collectively. Recently, with the spike in the stocks in the US market, everyone was wondering whether how the big or well-known investors sort of missed out on the rally. And I read a very interesting article which talked about how a lot of millennials who've been using, say, Robinhood or smart apps to start investing have now believed that largely a big fall is accompanied by a high rise in equities, as it happened even in 2008. So they've actually been over optimistic, and they have gone in and purchased companies like even JC Penney, which announced bankruptcy, assuming that it will go up. And these stocks have actually risen 200 to 300% since their lows in March. And all of your stalwart investors are actually clueless and are actually wanting to stay away from the market because it is not following the traditional finance rules. It is largely driven by a collective group of so many individuals who are investing money hoping to get returns, whereas the backing for those investment decisions really is not there. So that is what we're trying to understand. So, what was the need of behavioral finance? Well, like I said, in traditional finance, we always assume that an investor is rational, markets are efficient, and we make our decision on the basis of that. Another important theory in traditional finance is that of efficient markets. That markets are efficient, the information is available to everyone, and stock prices will tend to reflect all available information. But that is not always true. And also, people are not always rational. And that is why there was a whole branch which went into studying individual behavior. And the focus was not on justifying or rationalizing this behavior. They were taking the behavior as is. If an investor is making a decision which goes against the traditional theory, in behavioral finance, you take it as a bias and you try and simply look at it from that perspective. You don't need to write a theory on it. You can't um, sort of put a rule to it. You can't justify it. You take it as is. And that has been a key to the gaining popularity of the rising popularity rather of behavioral finance. So a lot of there's a good quote by Ben Bernanke on weather forecasts and how economic forecasts vary. And this is something I always find really funny. He said that, like weather forecasters, economic forecasters must deal with a system that is extraordinarily complex, that is subject to random shocks, and about which our data and understanding will always be imperfect. In some ways, predicting the economy is even more difficult than forecasting the weather because the economy is not made up of molecules whose behavior is subject to the laws of physics, but rather of human beings who are themselves thinking about the future and whose behavior may be influenced by the forecasts that they or others make. To be sure, historical relationships and regularities can help economists, as well as weather forecasters, gain some insight into the future. But these must be used with considerable caution and healthy skepticism. So this is another. This is just a quote that I always like talking about when I'm talking about behavioral finance, because I like the comparison that whether you can still forecast based on physics, but you can't forecast economy is based on how human beings react, and that is very unpredictable, and not all human beings are rational. So, importance of behavioral finance. Well, the purpose was that by understanding how investors and markets behave, it might be possible to modify and adapt behaviors in order to improve economic outcomes. It may also be necessary to adapt identified behavior to make decisions that adjust for that behavior. The ultimate goal was the integration of behavioral and traditional finance to produce a superior economic outcome, and the resulting financial decision would ideally be closer to the optimal outcome of traditional finance as we study in our theories. So, and the second part is actually getting the investor to adhere then to these theories. So, when we also talked about asset allocation, the emphasis on the individual was because once you involve the client and you take their preferences into account, they'll be more likely to also adhere to the suggested asset allocation because now they have a broader idea as to what the end goal is and why we are doing what we're doing. So they might be able to eliminate some initial biases and stick to the prescribed asset allocation because it's coming from a profession. No lecture on finance, specifically behavioral finance, is incomplete without a quote from Benjamin Graham or even Warren Buffett. So the investor's chief problem and even his worst enemy is likely to be himself. And we now study as to why this is true. So we'll just do a quick comparison of the traditional finance theory and how the behavioral finance theory is different from it. So traditional finance theory basically, like I said earlier, it assumes markets and investors are perfectly rational. Investors have perfect self-control. They are not confused by cognitive errors or information processing errors. They are risk averse. So traditional finance assumes that investors are risk averse They are self-interested utility maximizers. They will only go in between two options. They will always choose an option which maximizes utility. They construct and hold optimal portfolios, and these optimal portfolios are mean variance efficient. In easier terms, they have the highest return. They have the best risk to return ratio that they could achieve, and markets are efficient. So market incorporate and reflect all available and relevant. Now, what does behavioral finance say? Well, they say that investors are normal, not rational. They do have limits to self-control. They are heavily influenced by their own biases. They make cognitive errors that lead to wrong decisions. Then there's a theory of bounded rationality, which says that investors are acknowledged to have informational, intellectual, and computational limitations. And as a result, they may satisfy themselves rather than optimize while making decisions. An example of this is that there is always with time a wave of different asset classes that are fashionable, that become popular because everyone around you is talking about it. There was a wave in India where real estate was a very fashionable asset to own. People were always talking about, okay, I bought a flat here, I bought a property here, because it was a conversation starter. And then we saw a bubble, and now that bubble has bursted where you have developers not actually having the money to complete their projects, but their projects are sold out and people are stuck having bought a flat which actually does not exist. So that is what happens. And similarly, there was a time when everyone started suddenly talking about Bitcoin, and the price surged 4 times. And then people started entering at those high prices, and then the correction happened, and now it's a little more stable at its current price, but people are stuck at very high entry points. So this is what happens. Sometimes you may make decisions to satisfy some other need as opposed to optimizing your decisions based on logic. And then we talk about how a prospect theory is proposed, like against a utility theory. So, as we said, an investor should be looking between two options to maximize utility. So, traditional finance assumes that the investor will go completely by the book. But sometimes people get into the cycle where a good prospect is shared with them. It's a good story is created around it, and they will then go and choose the prospect without a mathematical or a logical reasoning behind it. They will still go for a bigger prospect than a probably a wiser decision. And within prospect theory also, a major concept that we always focus on in behavioral finance is loss aversion. So this is a study that's been done, and it's been noted that people are more heavily impacted by loss than they are impacted by gain. So if somebody was to gain, say, 100 rupees, they will not be as happy as they will be sad when they lose 100 rupees. And this is this is a very inherent trait to almost all individuals, all human beings. And this actually plays a major part in investment decisions that people make. So actually, it's not like clients are risk averse; they are actually loss averse. So if you are, say, in a script which has faced a tremendous loss and the company now in trouble, and if you are risk averse, you would completely exit the company. You will always anchor yourself to your buying price, and you're like, no, this loss will get averted. I will sell it once I recover my money. So you do not take into account the interest cost of the value you're getting today and how long it might take for you to recover that loss, or whether or not you will actually recover it, and you get stuck with bad scripts. So this is a very common thing that we note. So why does this happen? Well, this basically happens because of our internal biases and errors. Some of them we are very aware of. Some of them we have no clue about. And whenever I discuss biases or I talk about behavioral finance, the reaction I usually get is that people are like, "We know this. This is what new. What is it? What is new about what you're telling us?" Well, it's just like, say, knowing the right diet or knowing that exercise is good for you. Everybody knows, but it is easier preached than practiced. Practicing a steady exercise routine or a workout routine or following a good diet is easier said than done. It can't happen that easily. It's the same with behavioral finance. It's the same with these biases. We might even know they exist, but it's very hard to overcome these. And the four broad buckets are self-deception. That is, we mistakenly think we know more than we actually do. We tend to miss information that we need to make an informed decision. Sometimes there's heuristic simplification, that whatever is out of scope or whatever we can't understand, we keep it outside. We don't understand this, keep this outside. I don't need it to make my decision. It is mainly an information processing error. Then your emotions come in, like I talked about loss aversion as well. Your That's the major factor. You will take into it. Also depends on your mood. If you're in a bad mood, you might be more edgy. You might take the rash decision. If you're in a good mood, you might actually take undue risk on that given day than is warranted. And then social influences. When we talked about getting into fashionable assets for the sake of it, for bragging rights, where that might not be the best decision. So these are some of the biases. If I go deeper, these are the common biases that I talked about, and we'll talk about a few of them which are very common. And I like to talk about a few which people generally don't realize that they are actually facing in their real life. So the first one that I would actually like to talk about is a confirmation bias. And confirmation bias is, I mean, I have not met a single individual in my life who does not suffer from confirmation bias. It is basically a fact that you have a preconceived notion or you have a certain belief. Now, when you talk to more people, even or if you even go to them for advice, the moment they state something that differs from your existing belief, you filter that information out and you ignore it. But the moment somebody agrees with you or says something that is similar to your beliefs, you give a lot of weightage to what they are saying, and that further sort of strengthens your existing belief. And this is a very wrong thing that happens. And it is not just in investing or as an investor, this is in general in life also. This is very hurtful. And but this is something that we subconsciously anyway do. The second, which is very common, is the narrative fallacy. Now, this is when this is about this talks about how humans are always hungry for a good story. We Nothing appeals to us than a good story. And what happens is that if I build a good story around anything, people will accept it and people will follow it. So that's what happened with a lot of startups. All you have to do is create a good story. Your valuations keep rising. The actual profits a lot of times are not there. The model is not as solid, but because the story is there, you have investors pouring in. So the narrative fallacy is actually something that's very hard to overcome, because there are some good and genuine growth stories also out there. So the way to overcome it is to do your own research. Once you look at some information that's been presented, go back, verify the facts, do your research, and see if how feasible that narration is. Then I've covered loss aversion. There's also an anchoring bias. When I was talking about loss aversion, I also talked about how I will always think of the price at which I bought the stock. So that's a big anchoring bias. I have to make a decision today, irrespective of past events. I have to be forward looking, not backward looking. And I have to look at the future prospect of, say, a given stock or even a given bond, given the markets we are in. But we will always go back to our buying price and be like, no, I will not sell and book a loss below my buying price. So that's an anchoring bias. You have anchored yourself to a certain price and you will always stick to it. It also happens in certain stocks with people, and it has happened with me also, where I buy a stock at a certain price. I have sold it. Later on, I start reading and I see, okay, this company is doing well and there are further growth prospects. So I look at the price and I'm like, oh, I had bought it at 300, sold it at 330 rupees. Now the price is 800. This is very expensive. Although I have not done my research, the company might have over the years done so well that their price is actually it's a better value than it did have 3 years back. But I've not done any of that. I've just simply anchored on a previous price, and on the basis of that, I have decided that the given stock is not a good stock to invest. And another one that is very common, and when I talk about collectively how decisions impact, is herding. And herding is a problem that when everybody is doing something, you start doing, thinking that majority of the people cannot be wrong. And this is again a very common bias that's been repeatedly talked about. And slowly, what has happened is that as more people are reading about herding, there's actually a pressure to think outside the box. So the new bias that has come up is herding aversion. So you want to specifically think outside the box. And for the sake of thinking outside the box, for the sake of doing something different, you will take undue risk without having done the proper research. This is also common as how in travel it is becoming increasingly popular for people to explore or find new unexplored territories. So that is another example of herding aversion. You want to be different. You want to stand out, and that is a bias that is now developing. So it's from one extreme we've actually moving to the other extreme, but we have to stay in the middle. We have to make decisions irrespective of what the major population is doing. These are some of the common biases. And how do you overcome biases? So, like, it's very basic. Most of us are very reflexive. We like to go with our gut. We like to see what is out there, what uh, what comes to our heart. That is what they say: think from your heart, and you do it. But that is actually not the right approach. Thinking from your heart can have devastating consequences. So you have to be reflective. You have to have a system in place. You have to think before you act. And so what happens is in financial models, and when we do our asset allocation, that gives you a framework within which you operate. So you have some leeway, some discretion, but you've set the boundaries. So that allows you to at least stick to certain basics before making decisions. So in your emotions, you might not completely go in for a 100% high yield uh, debt portfolio when the credit market is going through such a rough patch. So that is what happens. That is the purpose that asset allocation serves, to sort of restrict your behavioral impulses. Obviously, some impulses are good. Sometimes you need to act on your feet. Sometimes you need to act fast. But the discretion that you're allowed should be limited, so that your risk is also limited. So the best way is to prepare, to make a plan, and pre-commit, to commit to what you're planning. And I will, after this, I'll just share a small write up that I wrote for clients. And it was about a direct equity purchase strategy in COVID times. I wrote this in about end of April. So I'll just share that with you also. And we have another small quote by Warren Buffett, like I said. It talks about how investing success doesn't correlate with IQ after you're above a score of 25. So once you have ordinary intelligence, then all you need is temperament, and the temperament to control the urges that get others into trouble. So that's the basic. What are our key takeaways? Well, a practical integration of behavioral and traditional finance may lead to a better outcome than either approach used in isolation. By knowing how investors should behave and how investors are likely to behave, it may be possible to construct investment solutions that are both more rational from a traditional perspective and, because of adjustments reflecting behavioral insights, easier to accept and remain committed to. The remain committed to portion is very important. And so, while the behavioral insights will not lead to easily or automatically superior results, it is hoped that they will help you improve your investment approach and enhance risk management. Ultimately, the game is about managing your risk. That is all we are talking about as investors here. And markets, like I said, are not always observed to be efficient. They're anomalous, and theories and models based on behavioral perspectives have been advanced to explain observed market behavior rather than expected or rational market behavior. And behavioral portfolio theory suggests that portfolios are constructed in layers to satisfy investor goals rather than to be mean variance sufficient. So, with this, our basic session comes to an end. I would like to open the floor to questions. Okay, so we do have a question by Deepa Mariam Alexander. She's asking that does information asymmetry regarding the markets has any role? Yes, it definitely has a role. That's what we're talking about. That in traditional finance theory, it is assumed that markets are efficient and all information is reflected in the prices. But in fact, that is not true for most markets. There is considerable information asymmetry, which leads uh, to investors actually not being able to take a complete view, and that brings in the scope of alpha generation. So that brings in the scope of analyzing in detail, and then sort of making decisions on the basis of that. So yes, information asymmetry is another example of why traditional finance theory is not cannot be completely relied on. Okay, so Ayush Agarwal has asked a question: is index fund the safest form of investment in equity? No. So no form of investment in equity is safe from any definition of safe, and the purpose of active investment or active management of finances is to beat the index. Now, beating the index becomes difficult as your markets become efficient. In India, for example, right now there is enough scope for generating alpha, and you can see that in past returns, although they are not indicative of future returns. You can see that it consistently there has been an outperformance of 6 to 7% over the index by leading mutual funds on a CAGR basis. So, with the information asymmetry that exists in our markets, there is enough alpha to be generated, and it is actually recommended that you go into active managed funds rather than index funds right now. Yes, as our markets mature, slowly index funds might be the way to go. Like in the US markets, index funds make sense because it's becoming harder and harder with markets becoming more efficient to beat the markets. Then from Ankita, we have a question. Okay, resources for behavioral finance. We will send out a message to all our attendees about further resources where you can view it. The basic definitions today that I've picked out are, like I said, from the CFA curriculum, so that it's easily you can always go back, purchase the curriculum if you're not studying, or if you're already studying the CFA, something you would have already read, and then build on it. So I've tried to add my personal experiences and examples on an existing good source of content. So we have a question from Anushka Kapoor that, in your view, what sort of securities should we invest or prefer in this COVID period? So, like we talked about, so in asset allocation, first you have to decide that how much of your money you want to put in securities or equity. That is the first step. Beyond that, then you go and take a sectoral approach. That how much, or you can take an approach by market cap. But given the COVID situation, I personally prefer taking an approach sectorally. That these are the sectors I want to invest in, and then identify the players or the stocks you want to invest in the given sector. I think that's a good approach. So the kind of sectors that you should look at is look at healthcare, but it's tricky because it's overpriced. You should look at also sectors that are maybe may rebound soon. So like auto is a sector that I find very interesting because it's been taking a beating for the last 2 years, and it's taken a very bad beating because of the COVID. So that actually might be a very good investment opportunity for the long term right now. So auto is another sector. There are certain sectors which have actually seen a rise and now will see a continued rise given the COVID period. And these are mostly companies in tech, but across sectors. So in financial services, companies which are technologically enabled will outperform even traditional big financial services players who are not able to adapt to technology. So be it stock broking, be it insurance, NBFCs, banking, go for companies which are which have a good tech focus. So yeah, that's like a broad overview. Yes, more than happy to share the PPT. Um, so we have Ayush asking that could you explain the difference between direct mutual funds and ETFs? So mutual funds, direct mutual funds are actually that's a plan. So mutual funds can be regular or direct. That's a different argument. But mutual funds can be both open-ended and closed-ended. And open-ended means that you can buy units of the mutual fund on a given price every day. So that's called the NAV, net asset value, that is determined every day on based on market price. So you can enter any day on that closing net asset value directly in the mutual fund. So that fund manager will get the money and can start investing. In an ETF, what happens is there is usually like a new fund offer. So they accept applications, people apply, and then they close the fund for further applications. So the uh, the fund manager will not get any more money. He is managing a set corpus, and if people want to sell their units, they will sell it in the secondary markets on the stock exchange, and other investors can take it. So sometimes there's also a discrepancy in the pricing. That suppose my net asset value of an ETF might be 40 rupees per unit, but it might be trading at 43 rupees because the fund manager is very good and he has a very good track record, and more people want to buy units of that ETF. So the value is 40, you're buying it at 43. That is possible. It can also be discounted. So that's the basic difference. The basic difference between your ETFs and open-ended mutual funds is that how you enter. So okay. Okay, so we have how is prospect theory and expected utility different. Like I said, so expected utility theory is simple. We've all studied it in basic economics. That you know you always want to maximize your utility. Given two options, you will assess how much utility you're getting from a given option, and you will make that decision. In a prospect theory, you don't look at utility alone. Something might give you a better return, but somewhere you might think, okay, this has a big prospect. Or, for example, I'm already holding a stock which is coming down in value, and the business model is not doing well. They are in a debt trap. They are not likely to do well, but I have bought it at a high price, and want to. I don't want to exit it because I have loss aversion, and I might have a new opportunity that I can invest in by exiting this opportunity at a loss, and that will give me higher returns. But I might just stick with my existing stock because I have loss aversion. I don't want to book a loss, and I have the prospect of recovering that. So that sort of overpowers the expected utility theory. So that is the basic difference. So I have a question about should you prefer mutual funds more than debt market? Okay, so I think introduction to financial instruments, you were told about mutual funds and the fact that there are actually many types of mutual funds. So a considerable portion of mutual funds actually invests in debt rather than equity. So there's a bigger portion of mutual fund investments in debt than in equity, and so you can always go in for a debt mutual fund. So it's not mutual fund and debt market are not sort of different from each other. Mutual funds are another way of investing in debt. So that's the thing. And so I used to ask, how important is it to deeply understand a particular sector before investing in it? It is very important. I think it is extremely important to understand a sector before entering a company in a given sector. You have to do a broad analysis. And the basic thing that you can start in is where in the economic cycle the sector is in. So if the sector is in recession and now will slowly start moving to recovery, that is a very good time to invest in the given sector. If a certain sector is in boom, then that is a sector you have to invest in very carefully. So a broad understanding of the sector is of paramount importance before you start picking stocks. Because if you go to specific stocks and then try and analyze the sector around it, you will always, a lot of biases will kick in. But if you look at the sectors and then move on to looking at specific stocks, you will eliminate certain sectors which do not have a good potential given your analysis, and you will ignore those companies completely. Because there will be great companies in every sector. All sectors will have leaders. So it's better to first identify the right sectors and then move on to identifying the leaders. Um, okay, so Nitya has actually asked a very good question. She's like, has behavioral finance and behavioral economics become tools to validate everyone's ideas, and no matter how peculiar they are? Has this introduced higher inefficiency in the market, or did it free up space for new markets to emerge? Well, the fact is that everyone's ideas are actually peculiar, and traditional finance ignores that fact. It is a fact that we make decisions based on emotion. It is a fact that everyone has a peculiar way of thinking. There is no one rational decision. Everyone makes the same, processes the same information differently. So, behavioral finance and economics, basically what they do is they accept this as a reality. They say we cannot define investor behavior. We have to observe it and then make changes to our model to accommodate this behavior. So, it's not freeing up space for new markets to emerge, but it is making our decisions more informed. It is more making our decisions more realistic. That is what it is. All right. Thank you so much. I will definitely be sharing the presentation also, and this session will be available on our YouTube channel soon. So you can always refer back. And thank you so much for all the mentees and the attendees to attend the session.